Hello, I would like to welcome you in this virtual forum to today's Norman E. Alexander Lecture in Jewish Studies. I'm Ann Thornton, Vice Provost and University Librarian here at Columbia, and I'm delighted to greet you wherever you are, and thank you for joining us for this online streaming of our annual event. We are pleased to honor the collecting, research, and teaching which the Alexander Library has enabled, and to showcase some outstanding collections. This annual lecture commemorates the founding endowment that created the Norman E. Alexander Library of Jewish Studies, including the establishment of the first ever librarian for Jewish Studies at Columbia University, a post held by our impressive colleague and moderator, Michelle Chesner, who is also the Vice President, President-elect of the Association of Jewish Libraries. Additionally, the endowment provides funding to assist in our acquisition of important Judaica resources and Hebrew manuscripts. Columbia holds one of America's largest collections. Norman Alexander's daughter, Gail Benderman, the founder of the Norman E. Alexander Library, who is with us today, has generously enhanced the library's support for Jewish studies at Columbia, for which we are deeply grateful. And on behalf of Columbia University and its libraries, I thank you for joining us and hope that you will enjoy learning more about this exceptional collection for scholarly work in Jewish studies, one of the most exciting and important resources at Columbia University. I'm now pleased to turn over this digital podium to Michelle Chesner, who will introduce our distinguished speakers. Michelle?
Thank you. Let's try that again. Thank you, Anne. Before we start our formal program, I just want to give you a little bit of logistics. Please send your questions to the panelists using the Q&A button. You'll notice that there is no chat option on this talk. We will have a general question and answer period following the three presentations. If you'd like to be added to the Norman E. Alexander Library's mailing list to hear more about activities in the library and other exciting programs like this one, please send your email to the Q&A with a request to be added. The rest of the attendees won't be able to see it. I'm very excited to welcome you all to the 11th annual Norman E. Alexander Lecture in Jewish Studies. When I started at Columbia Libraries 11 years ago, I had no idea how deep and broad our collection was. Over the last decade and more, I have done extensive research into the history of the Judaica collection, which dates back to Samuel Johnson, the founder and first president of Columbia University, and learned that its richness is thanks to the generosity of many people, donors, faculty members, alumni, friends, and librarians. For more on the collection, past and present, I encourage you to check out the Jewish Studies at CUL blog, and I'll post that link in the Q&A in a few minutes. I'm particularly grateful to Gail Alexander Benderman, Norman Alexander's daughter, a dear friend of the Judaica collection, and me personally, who has provided so much support and guidance over the years. It is thanks to Gail's generosity and the collaboration of many colleagues within Columbia University Libraries and beyond that next summer we will launch, at long last, an exhibition on the Jews of the Greek island of Corfu, in a joint program with the Jewish Theological Seminary. Columbia materials relating to our rich collection on Corfu will be exhibited both at JTS alongside the seminary's Corfu collections, as well as in the Chang Gallery of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia. Please keep an eye out for more information about that exhibit and related programming in the coming months. Columbia's Judaica collection is broad and vast, with materials spanning a millennia and more, and covering nearly the entire globe. The books and manuscripts in the collection have been cited hundreds of times over the last century and a half or so in important publications in Jewish studies. It is with this continued scholarship in mind that I am excited to present our three speakers today, all of whom have done research within our collections. In the interest of time, I will introduce all three of our speakers now, and we'll introduce them only very briefly before they each speak. Francesca Bregoli holds the Joseph and Ora Halegua Chair in Greek and Sephardic Studies and is an associate professor of history at Queen's College in the Graduate Center, CUNY, where she also serves as the director of the Center for Jewish Studies. Her research focuses on early modern Italian and Sephardic Jewish history. She's the author of Mediterranean Enlightenment, Livornese Jews, Tuscan Culture, and 18th Century Reform from 2014, and co-editor of Connecting Histories, Jews and Their Others in Early Modern Europe from 2019, and Italian Jewish Networks from the 17th to the 20th centuries, Bridging Europe and the Mediterranean in 2018. Her current project, informed by the history of family and the history of emotions, looks at the creation and preservation of affective and business ties in trans-regional Jewish merchant families, and it overlaps between family, commerce, and Judaism. Lea Schäfer studied linguistics at the Philipps Universität Marburg. She worked as a research assistant on a project on Western Yiddish in the long 19th century from 2011 to 2016. She defended her PhD thesis on the imitation of Yiddish in German fiction in 2015. After that, she started working at the Heinrich Heine Universität Duesseldorf on the material in the Language and Culture Atlas Archive of Ashkenazic Jewry, also known as LCAAJ, and started a project on the syntax of Eastern Yiddish dialects, known as SAID, which is based on the field notes of the LCAAJ, and which has been digitized by Columbia University Libraries. Her research interests center around historical orality, as well as language change and variation in the Germanic languages. In addition, her research focuses on structure and language change processes in German and Dutch dialects. In addition to a number of other publications, a book on morphological and syntactic structures in the LCAAJ materials is in preparation, as well as a publication of the data and selected maps from the LCAAJ collection at Columbia University Libraries. Maarten Hell is a postdoctoral historian at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, who also works as a writer and editor. Currently, he is finalizing his research for the NWO project, Diaspora and Identity, a combined archaeological and historical investigation into material life, ethnicity, and diet in the district of Vlooienburg in Amsterdam between 1600 and 1800. And I'm going to put a couple more links relating to Maarten's work. You'll see them as Q&A in a few minutes. Hell specializes in early modern history of the Dutch Republic, biography, maritime history, shipwrecks, foodways, diplomatic culture, and social care as main fields of interest. His thesis on Amsterdam drinking houses between 1450 and 1800 was published in 2017. And now to our program. A number of years ago, I was made aware of an archive of an Italian family of hatmakers originating in the city of Livorno, who had branched their business out to North Africa. Upon acquisition of the collection, made possible by the endowment established by Norman E. Alexander, I reached out to Dr. Francesca Bregoli, an expert on the early modern Livornese Jews, and asked her to come take a look at the collection. To my great excitement, Dr. Bregoli then spent quite a bit of time with the collection, learning and sharing important scholarship on this cross-Mediterranean trading family. And with that, Dr. Bregoli, please.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Let me start with thanks to you for inviting me to discuss my research today, and also for all the help that you provided over time while I was conducting that research. The materials that I'm going to discuss today, I think, are quite unique in many ways. I've always found this research especially fun, and I'm hoping to convey some of the reasons why to you today. So the documents that I will discuss are part of a larger corpus held at Columbia University and cataloged as a Manuscript General 237 Franchetti Family Archives. And as you can see from this Clio screenshot, the collection includes 6 items divided in 8 volumes and spans approximately a century from 1761 to 1859. My work has drawn specifically on manuscript general 237-2-1 and 2-2, which are letter books. So what is a letter book? A letter book, or in Italian, copia lettere, as you can see from this photograph of the first book's cover and frontispiece, is a book in which merchants would regularly keep a copy of outgoing correspondence. In this case, we have 2 large folio-sized volumes, which include some of the correspondence of an Italian Jewish merchant based in Tunis, Joseph Franchetti, dated from 1776 to 1790. And you can see his initials, IF, on both the cover and the frontispiece. Now, the name Franchetti is still well known in Italy, especially in Venice and in Tuscany, and some aspects of the family's more recent history have been studied extensively. In 1794, the family, which was originally from Mantua, relocated to Livorno, but before that year, and as far as we can reconstruct, for a good portion of the 18th century, the main household was in Tunis. So, and during the period covered by the letter books, the Franchetti were a typical example of a trans-Mediterranean Jewish family firm. Joseph Franchetti was involved in a business partnership with another Tunis-based firm, the Enriquez. In the 1770s and the 1780s, the core of Franchetti's business was the sale of Tunisian sheshia. These hats made in Tunis with European wool acquired from Livorno were popular in the Ottoman Empire, and Smyrna served as a key distribution center. Agents of the Salomone Enriquez and Joseph Franchetti Company were located in Tunis, Livorno, and Smyrna, a strategy that placed these entrepreneurs at the forefront of the sheshia trade in the last quarter of the 18th century. Joseph Franchetti additionally traded in Spanish grain, other foodstuffs, weapons, and occasionally Jewish ritual objects. The letter books preserved at Columbia do not, however, include the official correspondence of the Enriquez and Franchetti Company, which, to the best of my knowledge, has not survived, and which would have dealt almost exclusively with commercial issues. Rather, these letter books preserve copies of private, unofficial communication between Franchetti and several partners and associates, among whom were 2 of his young sons and his brother-in-law. This is an especially significant point, to which I will come back in a moment. Before we turn to that, let me give you a brief analysis of the correspondence. The 2 letter books include 397 letters. Of these, 396 were authored by Joseph Franchetti and 1 by his son Abram, the eldest of his children, who lived with him in Tunis. I have broken down the number of letters copied for every year entered in the letter books, the notes of the network in which Franchetti participated, the names of the recipients, and how many letters each recipient received. So as you can see, the 2 letter books do not preserve the entire outgoing correspondence of Joseph Franchetti. Some years are entirely missing, 1785, 88, 89. Some years, such as 1787 and 1790, are only represented by a very small number of letters. The first letter book includes correspondence between 1776 and 1780, and the second correspondence between 1781 and 1790. Here we see the destinations of the letters with a breakdown of how many were sent to recipients living in each of the locales. The great majority of the letters, almost 300, were written to correspondents in Livorno, with a fair number, 67, meant for correspondence in Smyrna, and a much smaller number for correspondence in other Italian and Mediterranean ports. Next, analyzing the correspondence by recipient, we see that Franchetti wrote to 65 different individuals, or in some cases, 2 people living together. On the list, there are some very prominent Livornese Jewish merchants, such as Paltiel Semach and Company, and David de Montel, and a few non-Jewish merchants as well. Now that we have a better sense of the scope of this source, let me talk a little bit about some of the themes that I have focused in my own work. Of the letters, 79, so approximately 20%, were directed to his sons, Reuben and Isaac, and his young brother-in-law, Benjamin Baruch, who were in Livorno and Smyrna. And these letters contain discussion not only of business, but importantly for my purposes, of family and private matters. Franchetti's letters to his son sometimes span 15, 18, even 23 pages, composed over a period of several days and characterized by a colorful and emotional style that almost resembles a stream of consciousness. So I mentioned at the beginning that these documents are quite unique. First, there is a lack of documentation to address trans-regional family life when it comes to the 18th century Mediterranean Jewish context, as opposed, for instance, to an abundance of sources for Christian merchants in the English-speaking world. Second, most extant Jewish business letters from this period do not illuminate the emotional lives of their authors and recipients. Franchetti's correspondence, on the other hand, offers a glimpse into personal, often fraught exchanges between relatives who knew each other well and did business together, and therefore helps shed light on a little studied but common aspect of 18th century Jewish life, the emotional relations and tensions between close relatives in trans-regional merchant families divided by great geographical distance. These documents illuminate, in other words, the affective components of trade, a subject that is at the heart of my current book project, and help investigate how Jewish merchants socialized and educated children living far away. They reflect prudential values and ideals of mercantile masculinity. And finally, they illuminate the role of Judaism in shaping conceptions of both family and commerce. Now, after marrying Esther Baruch, Joseph had 5 children. He had 4 sons and a daughter. As with many Jewish family firms, male members were dispatched abroad to secure the company's position. Joseph's eldest child, Abram, remained with his father in Tunis, but his younger sons were sent to learn the trades soon after reaching the age of majority. And while Yehuda occasionally returned to Tunis for short periods of time, Joseph did not see Reuben and Isaac for well over a decade. Possibly he may not have seen them again. In the impossibility of bridging this distance, Franchetti wrote letters. Correspondence was a tool to monitor and offer advice for 18th century merchants. They admonished distant children about which ideals and habits made one a good man and a successful trader. So Joseph Franchetti's letters served to guide, praise, chastise in light of specific merchant, family, and Jewish values. In the rest of my time, I will present a brief overview of some of my findings. The slides include some quotes from the letter, which we will not read out loud because of our time is short, but serve as illustration of the main points that I'm going to make. So to begin with, Franchetti's letters enjoin these children in intersecting obligations towards his casa intended both as household and firm, to preserve the family's reputation and capital from the ever-looming threat of ruin. We notice here a mix of overtly emotional terminology and contractual market ideals. Tangled ideas about love and market informed notions of fatherhood and sonship. And in such a contractual understanding, bonds of filial love were manifested through obedience. The lack of prompt submission to the paternal commands was liable to erode the loving relation between father and son. If the young men did not readily accept these orders, Franchetti characterized their lack of submission as bordering on or as outright illegitimacy. Not only was family conceptualized as business, therefore, but business done right was in itself a way to conceive of proper kinship relations. In Franchetti's world, obedience and economic profit were also closely connected with Jewish observance. The 18th century has been described as a time in which attitudes to trade allegedly became more secular and cosmopolitan, and the European commercial society ostensibly became more tolerant and open. Still, religion continued serving important roles for Jewish merchants as late as the last decades of the 18th century, particularly when it came to upholding a public facade of respectability within intra-Jewish commercial networks, which still played an important role in securing deals and making reputations. It was crucial for young merchants to preserve a good name as pious and observant Jews, to buttress their father's commercial reputation and credit. Jewish observance not only protected the virtue of Franchetti's sons, but therefore, it was also bound to guarantee sound business and success. For this reason, occasional reports concerning his son's religious laxity were a cause of great anxiety. The risks of estrangement in a foreign land, particularly the frequentation of non-Jews, the pursuit of secular pleasures, led to suspicions and possible misunderstandings. Children sent away at a very young age without familial supervision risked the perdition of their soul and the ruin of their fathers if they did not preserve their virtue and commitment to Jewish tradition, Franchetti feared. Reports of his son's penchant for theater and extravagant expenses sent him into anxious fits, just as did rumors about their religious laxity, as you can see here. It was in these occasions that Franchetti resorted to emotional rhetoric meant to induce guilt in his offspring in the hope of reforming their behavior, which typically hinted at the deteriorating health of members of the family or invoked their mother's emotional vulnerability, as you can see here. These expressions remind us once again of the all-consuming importance of public opinion and reputation for 18th century traders, but they also underscore the importance of guilt in shaping business relations in which love and interest were intertwined, and simultaneously, they demonstrate the limits of paternal reach and prudential advice in transregional merchant families. This leads me to my final point. What sort of safety networks were in place to control young men once they were sent away from home? When a boy was sent to a port where he did not come under direct familial supervision, in the absence of his blood relatives, other trusted adult men from the Jewish mercantile network in which the young man's father was embedded socialized and supervised him. Young men sent to apprentice away from home were placed in the care of Jewish business associates who worked and lived with them. The systems of control included also a broader web of Jewish commercial relations who kept an eye on the boys even without living or working with them, compelled by the ties of solidarity and reciprocity that connected them with other members of the network. Male Jewish friends and associates were recruited, often with moving calls for help, stressing familial intimacy, as you can see here, to monitor young family members stationed far away, to report back on the qualities and behaviors of these children, and to impart on them the values of mercantile honesty and religious observance that faraway fathers could only impress on their sons by correspondence. When it came to Jewish transregional households, it is possible to suggest discipline and order were thus enforced with the help of webs of quasi-paternal and quasi-fraternal relations forged within a family-like community of Jewish merchants. Let me conclude with some broader takeaways. Although there is a rich body of research on 18th century Christian merchant culture and on letters between trading fathers and sons in those communities, especially in the English-speaking world, the study of the experience and expectations of Jewish merchant families has only just begun. In many ways, Franchetti's letters conform to extant non-Jewish models of merchant letter writing to sons. When we look at the models of masculinity that Franchetti aimed to impart on his sons, at his fears, at his anxieties, we detect important commonalities with non-Jewish merchants, as we know from the studies of Margaret Hunt, John Smale, and Sarah Pearsall. From the work of economic historian Francesca Bregoli, we have learned that traders of different religious backgrounds employed common communication codes that enabled smooth cross-cultural transactions. This shared language of business was established on collectively recognized concepts of honor and credit. My research suggests that among these communication codes was also an emotional language of trade, based on shared parental hopes and anxieties concerning the correct rearing of future merchants. In turn, this points to the possible existence of a mercantile emotional community, to adopt Barbara Rosenwein's terminology, in which merchants made use of a shared emotional vocabulary of love and anxiety to bridge the physical distance with their children living away from home. At the same time, while Franchetti adopted ethical codes and harbored worries and anxieties shared by Christian traders, the family's Jewishness singles their experience apart from better studied English and Atlantic cases. Franchetti's letters suggest that Judaism continued playing a central role in some merchants' self-perception and hence in how they aim to raise their faraway children. This is evident in three respects. First, Franchetti emphasized the importance of Torah to achieve and protect commercial success, translating a theme popular in the literature of the Ars Mercatoria into a Jewish-specific idiom. Second, Judaism still defined the horizons of expectations and the uncosmopolitan worldview of this father, who was anxious about his sons losing themselves in strange lands and losing the firm's fortune with them because of dangerous cross-cultural encounters. Finally, Jewish circles played a key practical role, summoned as controlling agents webs of trusted Jewish traders envisioned as surrogate fathers and brothers, socialized and supervised young men far away from home, monitoring the intertwined paternal, commercial, and religious interests of fellow Jewish merchants. If you want to read more about this research and about the Franchetti collections, I invite you to read some of my work on it that you can see on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Franchetti. Dr. Franchetti, Dr. Bregoli. It's good to know that, you know, anxiety, parental anxiety is very universal in all cases. And it's, I'm looking forward to seeing more of this very interesting work. All right. In 2015, Columbia University Libraries received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize the field notes of the Language and Culture Archive of Ashkenazic Jewry, a project spearheaded by Uriel Weinreich, Mordechai Schechter, Michael Herzog, and others, to map the linguistic differences in spoken Yiddish across Eastern and Western Europe. The field notes included the results of approximately 2,500 questions asked of about 600 participants, and include a tremendous amount of data about many varieties of Yiddish that otherwise would have been lost following World War II and the decimation of a large part of Yiddish-speaking Jewry. Lea Schäfer was one of the first scholars to work on the digitized field notes, and she has done tremendous work in her studies of various Yiddish dialects. Dr. Schäfer.
So you should see now my presentation, I think. Thank you for having me. Yeah, the data I'm working with is are the field notes of the Language and Culture Archive of Ashkenazic Jewry, short LCAJ, and in a sense still unfinished atlas project initiated by the linguist Uriel Weinreich that provides and in a sense, yeah, that provides interviews with over 600 Jewish immigrants born in Central and Eastern Europe from the 1960s. Based on the locations of the informants' birthplaces, it is possible to capture the geographic variation within the Yiddish dialects. So the LCAJ interviews are based on a 200-page questionnaire, which includes over 300 translation tasks of full sentences, usually translated from English into Yiddish. Here I need to make a short note on Western Yiddish. So the LCAJ also interviewed people born in the former Western Yiddish area, mostly in Germany, the Alsace, the Netherlands, which by that time, however, had already been abandoned in favor of German. Thus, the translation tasks could only be queried in some places in the Alsace, where Western Yiddish survived into the 20th century. Regardless, the LCAJ is the biggest source of the former European Yiddish dialects from before the Holocaust. Understanding these European Yiddish dialects is essential to understand what is currently happening in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, where entirely new Yiddish dialects are emerging on the basis of these older dialects. As it is the framework of my project, Syntax of Eastern Yiddish Dialects, so short SAID, we evaluate the LCAJ translation tasks regarding grammatical structures based on the field notes the interviewer took during the interviews. Here you see an example of such a field note. In addition to the field notes, the LCAJ material includes many hours of sound recordings. However, without transcriptions of the recordings, it is extremely time-consuming and tedious to work with this material. Therefore, the SAID project is limited to the written sources of the LCAJ. And this has only been possible because the Columbia University Libraries have digitalized the field notes and made them available at an online platform in 2018. In the meantime, the audio recordings have also been digitalized by the university libraries. And as I just heard, also a lot of maps they made in the LCAJ project. And I do hope that at some point it will be possible to transcribe the audio recordings automatically or somehow. The SAID project, that is my assistant Mark Brode and me, and until 2020, we had 2 student assistants and an external freelancer, Tobias Wilkowski, who supported us with transliterations of the field notes. In the SAID project, individual analyses of specific grammatical phenomena have now been published, like articles on the subjunctive mood, nominal inflection, particle verbs, or past tense auxiliaries, like, for example, in some Yiddish dialects, you say, die Kinder haben gelegen in Bett, so you use the auxiliary haben, have, and but in most of the other dialects you find sein, so or sennen, die Kinder sennen gelegen in Bett. This is an areal variation that differs a lot in the material. Another example could be the inflection of proper names, or in this case, kinship terms. So you find the inflection of Bobbe, so grandmother, mostly in the northern part of the Yiddish dialect area, in the south and in the west. The female kinship terms and names are not that much inflected, or really comparing to kinship terms of a male person, like the grandfather. Here you see only in the west, in the northwest, there are a few villages where people wouldn't use the inflected form. Seiden would be the inflected form, and Seid, sorry, Seide, the non-inflected form. The funding of the SAID project ends next spring. Until then, 2 important publications are to be completed. So first, an atlas book like with selected morphological and syntactic structures, and secondly, the publication of the collected transliterations of the field notes. Currently, we have 230 translation tasks transliterated, and this data will be published together with maps of various lexical and grammatical phenomena as a Columbia digital resource. In addition to these qualitative studies of single phenomena and data, the transliterated field notes also provide a large database of the Yiddish language area in Eastern Europe. This makes it possible to perform quantitative geostatistical analysis of the Yiddish dialects for the first time. In contrast to classical dialectology, such analysis focus on similarities of dialects rather than differences, and try to model these similarities probabilistically. Thereby, dialect regions characterized by a more or less low dialect variance between neighboring locations can be identified. I fed such a statistical model for dialect similarities with data from 34 translation tasks. The geostatistical analyses were carried out using the online tool GapMap. As a result, the so-called fuzzy clustering provides a credible representation of the relationship between similarities and dissimilarities in the field note material. The outcome is a clear division of the language area into 2 main areas. So we have the northeast, here it's the pink area, and the southwest, that's everything that is blue and green. In the southwest, we find a further subdivision in the south, so the blue area, and the west, the green area. This map shows which dialects are similar and which are less similar to each other. Roughly, this picture corresponds more or less to the usual dialect divisions of Yiddish. In contrast to these, however, the cluster is based on significantly more points of comparison and more grammatical features, while classical dialect divisions of Yiddish are based on 1 to maximum 5 phonological criteria, like the dialect division of Prolutsky. As you see, he combines these areas, the pink and the blue one, into one main Eastern Yiddish part, or also the dialect division based on the LCAJ material provided by Herzog et al., which combines the main areas, the green and the blue ones, as one big dialect area. What is even more important about the picture of the fuzzy clustering is that the borders between the dialect areas follow historical political frontiers, namely the distinction of the two main territories, so the pink and the blue-green one, follows the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1618. And the subdivision of the southwestern dialect, so the green and the blue one, fits with the main borders of Central Europe in 1518, mainly the border of the Russian Empire. So even though the Yiddish language itself was never a national language of a separate territory, it was historically shaped by surrounding political conditions. And what we see here is the interaction of social circumstances with grammatical structures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schäfer. And as you note at the end, the Language and Culture Archive and the data that was done during that time contains so much more than only linguistic data. It's incredibly rich for linguistic data. But as you saw toward the end, it also gives us historical data. And in some cases, we recently completed an inventory of the maps. About 1,000 maps were created as part of the research project, which included all sorts of nuances of food and culture, such as whether gefilte fish was prepared sweet or salty. And there's a line on the map, whether pcha was served hot or warm. One particularly interesting map that we came across in our inventory notes the professions of non-Jews that spoke Yiddish within particular geographic locations. So there's still a tremendous amount of research to be done with this archive, which may be one of the earliest digital projects in Jewish studies, although that's another story for another time. Okay, so let's move on. In 1947, the libraries received a gift of 3,933 volumes by and about the philosopher Baruch or Benedict Spinoza. The Spinoza collection was formed by a combination of the Spinoza collections of Adolf S. Oko and Karl Gebhardt, and contains material by and about the famous Jewish philosopher. It was purchased and presented to the university by Dr. Simon L. Milner, Mrs. T.W. Lamont, Corliss Lamont, and Mr. E.A. Zabriskie. The full extent of the Spinoza collection at Columbia also has yet to be tapped, but one manuscript of a work by Spinoza's former teacher and member of the rabbinical court who excommunicated him, Saul Levi Martera, has proved very interesting, if not for Spinoza studies, at least as far as we can tell at this point. It has the only contemporary portrait of Martera, and was written by another important figure in the Dutch Jewish community, one that we'll hear about more today from Dr. Maarten Hell. Go ahead.
Yes, I hope everybody hears me like this. I'm gonna check if my mic is working.
It's all good.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you for this kind introduction, and I would like to tell something about my research on the people and material culture of Vlooienburg. And this used to be the center of the Jewish neighborhood in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I will focus on the situation in the 17th century, when this was the home of Sephardic merchants and Hebrew printers, but also of other immigrants from all over Europe and even from the world. One of the residents is the Iberian merchant Abraham Idanya. He will be in the spotlight because we are able to show parts of his manuscripts, including this rare self-portrait, which we see here in the center of this picture. For anyone who is not familiar with the infrastructure of early modern Amsterdam, I will have indicated the Jewish quarter and the Vlooienburg area on this map. We can see here the black line indicating the Jewish quarter, and the red line is the Vlooienburg island. And in the 17th century, the economy prospered and Amsterdam expanded into a commercial metropole. The population doubled to over 200,000 in the course of a century. With the arrival of the Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, and other migrant groups, this part of Amsterdam transformed into a multi-ethnic neighborhood. Contrary to the situation in other European cities, the Jews did not live segregated from Gentiles, but in a mixed urban quarter, with Vlooienburg as its core territory. This artificial island consisted of 4 blocks of houses and was surrounded by the Amstel River. You can see here the Amstel River, which is the main river of Amsterdam. And here is the harbor of Amsterdam, which is in the north, but this map is upside down as they used to place it. This is the Dam, the central square of Amsterdam, so you can see the distance to that. This island was popular among all sorts of religious dissenters, mainly Jews, but also Catholics, Lutherans, and English Puritans. Living close to each other, the social and commercial contact was inevitable, in stores, in streets, and in taverns. Yet all groups had their own religious and social institutions and largely lived separate lives. Jewish newcomers also took residence in and around the Jodebreestraat, which is this street here, and on 2 less prominent islands, Marke and Eilenburg, these 2. And wealthier Sephardim preferred to house on the canal Nieuwe Herengracht, which is this. Here we see the synagogue of 1675. So there was spatial segregation that divided the Jewish quarter in upmarket areas on the canals and less expensive living in streets and back alleys. But even within Vlooienburg, on that island we just saw, there was spatial segregation. Here on the left we see the upscale Zwanenburgerstraat, which was near to the Amstel. And on the right, a much later picture of poor living in the inner streets of Vlooienburg. Vlooienburg was a popular place to settle because of its cheap and available housing. For Jewish settlers, other pull factors were the proximity of co-religionists, synagogues, and socio-religious institutions, such as a meat hall and schools. Besides this Jewish presence, about 1/5 of the population of Vlooienburg was Christian. Considering this mixed composition and the freedom of settlement, it was never a ghetto such as existed in Italy and Germany. In the 19th century, pauperization turned Vlooienburg into a deprived area. Before the outbreak of World War II, houses were abandoned and demolished and population numbers dropped. During the German occupations of the Netherlands in the 1940s, the last Jewish residents were deported. After the war, Vlooienburg was a ghost town, and in 1981-82, the remaining area was excavated prior to the construction of a new city hall and a concert hall called Stopera in Dutch. 2 building blocks were recovered, resulting by the archaeologists, resulting in the remains of 100 houses and 95 cesspits, shown on the right. These privies were also used for the disposal of domestic refuse, including household goods, animal waste, and personal objects. And in the Dutch research project Diaspora and Identity, archaeologists and historians studied the finds to learn more about material culture, diet, and the daily life of the population of Vlooienburg. My historical research resulted in a list of 350 principal residents, their location and details about their background, like family, occupation, daily life, religion, and possessions. One of these residents was the rabbi, printer, and famous writer Manasseh ben Israel. He lived together with his brother-in-law and their families next to the corner of the Amstel River, which I just showed you, where also his printing house was located. Manasseh ben Israel loved his neighborhood, while Jews and Christians lived happily together, according to him. Here is a selection of the household waste from the cesspit behind his house. Valuable items such as printing components were of course sold or bequeathed after his death. Here above left, we see the house of Manasseh ben Israel again on a map of Berkenrode from 1657. And he was not the only famous person living in the neighborhood, as we can see on this small celebrity tour. Medical doctor Ephraim Bueno, painted by Rembrandt, lived on one of these corners of the Korte Houtstraat, which is this street. Close to Baruch Spinoza, we all know, and whose father rented a house at the Houtgracht, which was this house. The painter Rembrandt Verijn lived shortly at a sugar refinery on Vlooienburg, at the Vlooienburg Island, before he and his wife Saskia moved to the, as currently known, Rembrandthuis in the Jodenbreestraat. Despite the presence of Rembrandt and other painters in the neighborhood, there are no contemporary illustrations of Vlooienburg at street level. And that is why the 4D research lab of the University of Amsterdam developed this historical reconstruction of the main street around 1660. In order to show the diversity of the neighborhood, we can walk around the block and see who lived behind the doors. On this right corner, for instance, was the bakery of a Lutheran migrant from Germany. He also produced for the Sephardic religious community, for instance, matzo bread during Passover. Supervisors oversaw that he complied to the dietary laws. Moving further, the map here shows the L-shaped form of a large entertainment complex. This was a combination of a tavern and indoor tennis court managed by a Protestant proprietor. The ball game was extremely popular until the last decade of the 17th century, when it was outspaced by other games, such as golf. In the downfall, the tavern became a brothel where Sephardic youngsters would visit Christian prostitutes, which was forbidden by local law. Around 1680, the tavern was a notorious gambling den owned by a non-religious Jew from Rome, who also had a forbidden relationship with a Christian woman. At the right here, we see some examples of drinking glasses and a pipe found in the cesspit behind the tavern. The two houses left to the tavern were owned by the printer Emmanuel Buenveniste, a Jewish migrant from Venice. Among the many Hebrew works that he printed, most elaborate was his edition of the Babylonian Talmud. Buenveniste had to make ends meet with other sources of income, just like many other Jewish printers. He owned a dairy farm just outside Amsterdam and a barge for transporting his milk, the milk from his cows, to Amsterdam. Buenveniste also rented rooms to tenants. Two Sephardic women shared one apartment at the second floor of one of his houses. To the left of Buenveniste in this house here, a black woman named Vela lived, perhaps as maidservant for one of the Jewish merchants who lived there. We only know of her existence because she was buried from this address. Most of the blacks in 17th century Amsterdam lived on Vlooienburg and surrounding streets. They were brought from the colonies by Sephardic merchants, and some continued as servants in Amsterdam because slavery was forbidden here, so they had to be paid. Other blacks lived on their own and made a livelihood, for instance, as sailors, actors, or soldiers. Let's continue the tour around the block. The last house before the corner of this street, the Lange Houtstraat, was the home of the accountant Joshua Sarfati Pina. He published a study on international money transfer, and he also financed and corrected the edition of a Jewish prayer book. Manasseh ben Israel, mentioned before, lived on the other side of the block, and a few houses further was the first location of the printing company initiated by the Sephardi Joseph Attias. Joseph Attias was the first Jewish printer allowed by the local craft guild. He published his Hebrew Bible with the approval of both Jewish and Christian scholars. You see it here on the left. This was not the only multi-confessional project. Together with the Catholic printer's widow, he published Christian Bibles for the English and Scottish markets. Millions, according to himself. Attias was able to print large volumes in short time because he used a new technique with stereotypes. After his death in the year 1700, his printing cabinet containing the materials to fabric Hebrew fonts survived. We can see it there on the right, and it's on display in Amsterdam in the Adolf Pierson. Now we take a ride into the Korte Houtstraat, and this street housed the first religious museum of Amsterdam, behind the home of the Hebrew teacher Jacob Jehuda Leon. You see him here on the left. Visitors from all over Europe paid a small admission fee to witness his wooden scale model of Solomon's Temple of Jerusalem. The design of the large Portuguese synagogue, finished in 1675, probably was based on this model. Across the Temple Museum was the home of Gaspar Mendes del Arroyo. He was born in Dom Benito, a village between Madrid and the border with Portugal in Extremadura. And he lived in Madrid as well-to-do merchant. In 1660, he and his wife and their 2 young sons had to escape the Spanish Inquisition, leaving behind a good business, family, friends, and a third part of his equity. They found refuge in the Dutch Republic and in Amsterdam converted to Judaism. Mendes del Arroyo took the name of Abraham Idanha, which reveals a Portuguese background. Abraham bought a house in the Kortehoutstraat, this house here, and purchased another piece of real estate in the neighborhood. These expenses indicate that he was able to bring a large amount of money and valuables from his home country. By letting the lower floors of his new home, he earned a modest income from his property. Abraham and his family lived in the 2 rooms at the upper floor of this house here. In his new hometown, Idanha continued his commercial business, and he was also involved in high-risk short selling, which was popular among Jewish stock traders. Reaching the age of 60, he became active as a writer. Some of his work is kept in the Amsterdam City archives. These manuscripts were partly written by himself and partly copied by him in Spanish. In the form of letters to a representative of the Inquisition in Madrid, he describes his new hometown Amsterdam full of praise. These letters seem to have been written to convince Jews, conversos in Spain, to find a safe haven in Amsterdam, where they could practice their religion in freedom. The copies Idanha made were mainly polemical works against Christianity, Catholic as well as Protestant, such as this manuscript of Rabbi Saul Levi Montera, the treatise on the truth of the law of Moses, which he read in the Spanish translation, which we can see here on the left title page. These polemical works in Iberian languages were kept out of print because of the internal censorship of the local Jewish community, but they circulated in manuscript. Idanha produced his version of Montera's treatise in 1683, so 13 years after it had been written. This copy found its way to Columbia University Library, as you just heard. Idanha also added a portrait of Montera preaching behind the pulpit in the new Portuguese synagogue. And this primitive drawing is one of the rare pictures of the rabbi philosopher, which can be compared to 2 disputed attributions. Is this the same person here? The version of Idanha, here the 2 versions of Romein de Hooge and a teacher a pupil of Rembrandt, who has also been identified as Comenius, the Czech education reformer. The beard, the nose, and the hair look identical, but the drawing is too primitive to be sure, is my opinion. At the top, we see here Idanha painted a set of curtains, and the same set is shown on his self-portrait and the title page of his manuscript. These curtains are mentioned in the inventory of his household, made up after his widow had died in 1693, 3 years after Idanha himself had died. These woolen textiles were in the color purple, so this document tells us. This brings me to the material legacy of Abraham Idanha. His house was not very rich, furnished or decorated, and with some vintage chairs to sit on, a small table, 6 cheap paintings, old kitchenware, and outdated textiles, it seems like much of his wealth had evaporated. Even broken pottery was registered in the inventory lists. Other ceramics ended up in the cesspit at the back of his house. One of these objects was later dug out, and that was this piece of ceramic, which we see here on the left. It was used to heat a food stove with coals. And I'm quite moved by the idea that Abraham Idanha, never quite accustomed to the northern climate, used this item to warm his Spanish feet. Turning back to Vlooienburg, here we see the old neighborhood transforming into the current view of the town hall, which is this slide. Vlooienburg completely vanished. Nothing survived except the life histories of the ancient and residents locked up in the archives, and part of their household waste, which we just saw. Documents and pictures, like the rare self-portrait of Idanha, will help us shine a new light on their existence. And therefore, I would like to express my gratitude to the Library of Columbia University, especially to Michelle for retrieving and scanning this manuscript. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hell. What a wonderful journey through this neighborhood. That was really, really fantastic. Thank you to all the speakers, to Francesca Bregoli, Lea Schäfer, and Maarten Hell for these wonderful presentations. It's an absolute pleasure to care for Columbia's Judaica collection, but there is nothing quite so wonderful for me than seeing the collection used and studied in so many ways. So I'll ask all of our presenters to turn their cameras back on, and we have some time for a few questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to them as we can. Our first question is for Maarten. During the 16th and 17th centuries, do you know if in Vlooienburg there was separation or integration between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews?
Yes, that's of course an important question. In the 16th century, there were no Sephardi or there were no Jews yet. But in the 17th century, the first Ashkenazim, of course, came, and they later outnumbered, in the early 18th century, they outnumbered the Sephardim. And there are indications that they have, within this small Vlooienburg area, that they had their own streets, back alleys, I should say, where they resided. And I have my earliest real document for that is from 1748. So it's in the 18th century. But we can very clearly see concentrations of Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And Ashkenazim were largely concentrated near the Polish synagogue, which used to be in this Vlooienburg area. So yes, there was both groups were at the island, and in the 18th century, mostly Ashkenazim were on the island because they outnumbered the Sephardim by manifold. So the Sephardim, a part of them, the wealthier ones, went to the Nieuwe Herengracht, which I mentioned, so to the canals and to more upscale locations. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yes, thank you. A couple of people have asked about recordings. So yes, this is being recorded, and there will be a recording made available probably in a few weeks, and we can send that out we'll send that out to everybody registered. I had a question for Francesca, which is how common is it to find these kinds of letters and sort of the deep emotional aspect to the letters? Have you seen that in other archives, in other kinds of collections like this, or is this? I mean, you had mentioned the non-Jewish context. I'm wondering if you've seen this in the Jewish context as well.
The other place, it's a great question, and a lot of the research that has been conducted so far has worked on official correspondence, official business correspondence, which would not have the element of the personal, the private. I have seen other letters, not in a Mediterranean context, but I have taken a look at the correspondence of Abraham Gradis, a French Atlantic merchant, Sephardic merchant in Bayonne. And we do find, and in that case, the fascinating element is that there are some letters from the wife of Abraham Gradis to their child, their grown-up child, their 23-year-old child. So we do find some elements, but these letters do seem unique in terms of the emotional component, which is more in line with other documents in Italian Jewish petitions, applications that I have seen. So there seems to be what I'm considering right now is that there may be a rhetoric of paternal, emotional anxiety, affliction that appears in letters like these, but also in other documents. And that seems to have been common among late 18th century Jewish and non-Jewish authors. But the only other body of documents where I've seen something comparable is the correspondence of the Gradis family, which is from the 1720s.
Interesting. Oh. I mean, because we see personal letters, but not necessarily within the merchant letters. We have a couple of examples of like mothers saying you haven't written, I mean, even in the Cairo Geniza.
Yes, we do, exactly. And then there is the Geniza, where the personal and the commercial are very much intertwined.
Yeah.
And what we see in these letters, which is different from the Geniza, is the extent of the emotional outpour, which follows models of sensibility that are very much articulated according to late 18th century models of intimacy. And I don't think we've seen, I've looked at early modern Geniza letters, and I've seen complaints by sisters writing to brothers, or family members writing to each other saying, I haven't heard from you, well, what's going on? But you don't have the same outpour of sensibility that you do find in these letters. So while before you were saying it's nice to see that parental anxiety is a long-standing phenomenon. Of course it is, right? Of course it is, but how is it expressed? Depending on the time period, depending on the cultural context and the grammar available, right? The sort of grammar of the heart and grammar of parental anxiety that is available to writers in different contexts.
Yeah. Wow. All right, a question for Lea Schäfer. On the map, and I'm not sure which map she's referring to, what is the dark gray or purplish area in the south? Is that Hungarian? Do you want to
should I share
that map toward the end?
The Hungarian Yiddish, or also the data from the Western Yiddish part, where we have enough data to give it into this model. They are a bit fuzzy indeed, in another way. So we have so in the east of Hungarian of modern geographical area of Hungary, we have dialects that well fit with what we would call Central Yiddish, so the green area, as you see. But then in the south and west, there are dialects that are more like the northeastern dialect. So when you look in what's happening in the Russian area, so there also we have this gray violet area. So I know the colors are also not that, they are just helping to get what's behind so the clusters, but so some of the Hungarian dialects are more like the northeastern dialects, and those who were mostly in the Transcarpathian area are more like what we have in the Central Yiddish dialects. So but I think in this case this picture is really vague. We have not that many data for the Western Hungarian dialects and also the other Western Yiddish dialects. The statistics just tries to make the best use of this data I'm feeding it, and in a way it's I wouldn't say it's really clear in this case. So I just want to focus you on the structures that are more valid, and those are the pink, the green, and the blue areas. What's around this is not enough or not proper data to compare it in a way, I would say. Is this answering the question? I hope.
If you'll turn to the geopolitical map that you had, there was a follow-up question. The gray area in the south, also on the gray area, and whether that is impacted, and maybe the answer is, like you said, it's there isn't enough data there because it's too far to the south. But did you want to address that at all?
Yeah, what was the question exactly?
In terms of the geopolitical conditions causing the evolution of Yiddish dialects, how does that gray area in the south factor in?
Okay, so the whole gray area is where I only have really few data from Western Yiddish. So that was not enough data for the tool to compare it with anything. So it's just like
so
zero
it's
information.
It's uncertain.
Yeah. And yeah, of course, this also goes together with where German was mostly spoken in the 19th century and early 20th century, and where most of the Jewish people switched to German and gave up Yiddish. So yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Maarten. What is stereograph printing and how did it help with production?
I was afraid for this question already, so I had to look it up myself. It's called cliché printing or cliché druk in Dutch, and that means each page of an edition was composed and affixed in iron frames. But you can read a lot about it in Andrew Pettigrew or and Arthur der Weduwe book about printing in Dutch Republic. You have it probably there in your kijk. Bookshop of the World. That's what I was trying to.
Yes, it's a wonderful book on print in the Dutch Republic.
And there's a lot more about Joseph Attias because he was such an extraordinary man.
Yeah.
As printer and yeah. So.
Yeah. Thank you. If there are no other questions, I think one just came in. Sorry, this citation for the book. It is, let me actually put it into the chat. It's called The Bookshop of the World. Making and trading books in the Dutch Golden Age by, and I have to just approve it, one sec. So there we go. And that's by Andrew Pettigrew and Arthur der Weduwe, I think, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it's wonderful on Amsterdam as sort of a center of printing generally, which those who know Jewish print know that Amsterdam was a center of Jewish printing for quite some time, but it was really the center of printing in a lot of ways all over. So I have little stickies in mine because there's all sorts of interesting information in there. Highly recommended. I have another question from Jordan Katz for Maarten. I am fascinated by the use of archaeology to understand the neighborhood of Vlooienburg. I'm wondering if there are objects that have illuminated the role of women in this context.
It's attributing materials, objects to persons is extremely difficult, and we know the cesspits were behind a house, and sometimes 3 or 4 households were putting their waste in those cesspits. So that's very difficult. There are a few personal objects which are mentioned that there were, and a few are specific Sephardic family names, female family names. So that was very specific. You know that has to be related to this person.
Knowing just a bit about Jordan's research, perhaps something related to birth. I don't know if there would be particular objects that were found in that.
Yeah, but you can ask yourself in general which objects are.
What are the objects?
Feminine. Are feminine. No, the objects are amazing. That's for almost everything, except of course valuable things, items that you wouldn't throw away. But it's really fascinating to see what there is, and thousands of objects. But I wouldn't like to say this is kitchenware, thus it is feminine or something. But because it also can be like eatery or something, which was at that place. So I think it's very dangerous to attribute archaeological finds, although I just attributed chamber pots to Manasseh ben Israel. But it's difficult to see the female object. Of course, we have like combs and which were typical for female, and wires also. How do you call them? The
mirrors, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you use for mostly
right, but
for
even
female
that
use.
is like you say, it's hard to gender.
Yeah, it's hard to gender. That's nice. That's good verb.
Yeah. All right. With that, I'm going to once again thank our wonderful speakers, Maarten Hell, Francesca Bregoli, and Lea Schäfer for just a fantastic session on the wonderful work that you're doing, and looking forward to hearing more about all of your researches and for further use of our collections. So I encourage everybody to come and take a look at what we have and see how it can impact your studies as well. All right. Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.